Hi, this is Tamara at mooglyblog.com, and in this video I'm going to be demonstrating how to make the Big Sky Shawl, which is a free pattern you can find on mooglyblog.com. There's a link in the description, so if you're watching this on YouTube, please go there to get a printed copy of the pattern with all the details you need. Now let's go ahead and get started. I'll be using Lion Brand's Homespun, and this pattern calls for a P or Q hook, so I'll be using my Clover Jumbo. And then I do also recommend a stitch marker for this pattern. In this case, I'm using some Clover stitch markers. Let's begin. All right, so one thing you do want to have, as I mentioned, is a stitch marker. This is a bulky yarn, so I'm going to pick one of the bigger ones right here. I love these little guys. They look like sheep. Let me set aside the rest, and we'll start crocheting. Now, this pattern begins with a magic circle. So I will wrap the yarn around my finger twice. If you really don't like magic circles and you have another method for beginning patterns in the round that you prefer, you can go ahead and do that. We're not going to actually be making a pattern in the round, but we start with a center circle like this anyway, and you'll see how that works here in a few minutes. So with our magic circle, I'm going to go ahead and chain 2, 1 and 2, and then I am going to double crochet 7 times in the ring. And that chain 2 I just made will not count as my first stitch. It's just a turning chain for this pattern. So working with this big hook can be a little tricky if you're not used to it. But one of the great things is when you make patterns with giant hooks like this, they really do fly off the hook. So that's 3 double crochets, 4 and 5. And remember, when you're working into a magic circle, every time you work into that ring, you want to make sure to go, of course, through the ring itself, but to capture that tail end in there also, as that's what we'll be using to tighten it up. So where were we at? 5, I think. So this is 6 and then 7, like so. There we are. Let me just count and make sure I didn't miss one here. Remember that chain 2 does not count as a stitch. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 stitches made. And in the fourth one, 1, 2, 3, 4, the middle one, that's where I want to put my stitch marker. And this stitch marker with this yarn is even a little small, so even a bigger one might be handy, but I think this will work fine. So once I've got those 7 made, I'm not going to be working into this circle anymore, so I can go ahead and use the tail to pull that closed. And even though we began with a magic circle, we're actually going to be working back and forth in rows. And that stitch marker is going to tell us where our center increase point is, which will become the bottom point of the shawl. So we'll want to move this up with each round just to help us keep track of where we are. So I'll put my hook back in and we can begin row 2. Again, we're going to start with the chain 2. This does not count as a stitch. I'm going to turn to work the other direction. And in the first stitch, I'll work 3 double crochets. So we are also going to increase at each end, but we don't need to really mark those unless you feel like you want to. Nothing wrong with marking extra stitches for your own reference. But since it's the beginning and the end, usually typically easier to find. So we've got our 3 double crochets there in that very first stitch. Then I am going to double crochet to the marked stitch. So we've got 2 more here, because remember that was in the 4th stitch, and then we are at the marked stitch right here. And I know it's kind of hard to see these stitches. Hopefully you already know how to make double crochets. With this big bulky yarn and big hook, it's hard to really demo the stitches themselves, but so hopefully this is showing you a good concept of how the pattern works. Now when we come to that marked stitch, we're going to go ahead and also work 3 double crochets in this stitch. So 1, 2, and pull up a little bit more yarn here, and 3. And it's okay to leave the stitch marker there until you're ready to move it, but I do want to move it at this point because I'm going to move it up into the center of those 3 double crochets right there, like so. All right, and then I double crochet again in each stitch till I get to the last one. So in this case, that'll be 2 stitches until I'm at the last stitch of the previous row, well, which was the first one made. So in that very last stitch right there, I will work 3 more double crochets. Let's see here. Sometimes getting under both loops of that first stitch there doesn't want to be easy, but there we go. So there's 1 and 2 and 3. I need a little bit more yarn pulled up here. 1 second. All right, there we go. Now, rows 3 through 16 are exactly the same as what we just did. Now, the number of stitches, obviously, between the first stitch and the marked stitch will continue increasing, but we're going to increase at the beginning, at the end, and at the middle. So let's do one more. We're going to start with a chain 2, and then, of course, work 3 double crochets in that first stitch. 1, 2, and 3. And then just double crochet in each stitch till we get to the marked stitch. 1, 2, and 3. And looks like we've got a few more here. 4 and 5. So for row 3, we'll have 5 before you get to that marked stitch there. Remember, those marked 2 loops, that's where you're going to work 3 double crochets for your center point. 1, 2, and 3. And this is a good point to put your hook down, move that marker up to the center of those 3 double crochets, like so. See, 1, 2, 3. We've got the center one marked. So now we just double crochet in each stitch till we get to the end again. 1, 2, and of course, like I said, this number will keep going up as the shawl grows because you've got all those increases added every time. And the only reason that this pattern actually changes at row 16 is because that's where I put in a color change. So if you were making this all in one color, you would just keep going until you have the shawl the size you want, or as directed in the pattern, about 20 rows. Just have to, sorry about my head getting in the way there. Sometimes I have to peek at the written pattern. It's been a little while since I actually wrote this, so I want to make sure I get it right for you. Okay, so you can see it is starting to take shape. Get that end out of the way there, then it'll be easier to see. We've got a tiny little shawl started, and it's just going to keep growing in that direction. So if you follow the written pattern, you will just be repeating that same row over and over again with a couple of color changes until you get to the border. So let's pretend we've made our 20 rows with or without stripes, personal choice, and now we want to work the border. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin the border. I've got, sorry, I got a little twisted there. I've got a chain 1, and then I'm going to work 3 single crochets in the first stitch, single crochet along in each stitch, then don't jump them, don't skip them. When you get to the marked point, 3 single crochets there, single crochet in all of these stitches. Then we get to the opposite point, we're going to work 3 single crochets there, so the other shoulder, if you will, and then we'll work across the top, but we'll get to that when we get to it. So if you prefer to work all 3 right away in that first stitch, you can, or you can work 1 now and work 2 when you get across the top. It's up to you. Everybody likes to do their borders a little differently. For the sake of simplicity, I'll go ahead and work 3 right now. 1, 2, and 3. And then I will work a single crochet in each stitch until I get to that marked point stitch, like so. And this is border row 1, very simple, just basically single crocheting around. And of course, if you've made a full 20 rows of this shawl, you'll have a lot more of these to make, these single crochets. You can see I'm working into the marked stitch, so I've made 3 single crochets all in that stitch, and I'm going to move my marker up to the middle one, right there. So I know exactly where that is for border round 2. Then I will single crochet in each stitch till I get to that last stitch of the previous row, or first stitch made in the previous row, since we're turning. And we're almost there. And again, this is an abbreviated version of the pattern, but all those rows are just like rows 2 and 3, which I did demo. All right, so we're at that last stitch. There's 1. We'll do 2 more, 2 and 3. And then what we're going to do is work across the top of the shawl, which is actually the sides of our rows, since we're working back and forth this way. So in the side of each row, you're going to work 2 single crochets. If you've changed colors, it can be a good idea to work those stitches in those colors, so you can switch colors as you go across here if you don't want to. If you want to stay solid, you can do that too. And because this is such big chunky yarn with so much texture, I'm just going to go ahead and work my single crochets right around the whole stitch. I don't want to try and get this big hook through those individual stitches. I think this looks just fine this way. Sometimes it can be hard to tell exactly where those rows are, so it helps to sort of turn your work and say, okay, yep, that's the last stitch of the row. And it doesn't matter if it's the chain 2, which I know we said doesn't count as a stitch, that you're working into here. It's just wherever you think looks good. Just try and maintain consistency across the top of the shawl here. Don't have to try and work back into that magic circle that we tightened up. That'd be difficult, to put it mildly. So we just crochet evenly across the top here. 2 in each row I find works best for me. If you find that you need a little extra one here or there, or maybe one less, to make your row lay really straight, that may be the case. There's nothing wrong with that. And then I get to that first single crochet that I made here. Let me find it. Yep, 1, 2, 3. There it is. So I'm going to join to that one with a slip stitch, like so. Let me see, did I go through a slip stitch? I was glancing at my instructions when the stitch happened. Let me do that one more time. Go into that one, yarn over, and pull through both. There we go. Yep, that's a slip stitch. Okay, so let's make border round 2. Now, in the original pattern, I changed colors for this round, but of course you can do it in the same color if you like, and that's what I'll do here for the sake of time. So for this one, I'm going to chain 1 again, and then in that first stitch right here, I'm going to work a single crochet, and then a double crochet, like so. Let me pull up just a little bit more yarn. There we are. Then I am going to skip the next stitch right there, and in the stitch after that, work another single crochet and double crochet. And I'll continue to do that until I get down to the stitch right before the point, depending on if you've added rows or taken away rows. And of course, we haven't made the full set of rows here in our little doll-sized shawl. Then you might need to fudge it a little bit, not skip a stitch or skip an extra stitch. You can play with this border round a little bit and just find the way that works best for you if you need to fudge the stitch count just a little. So basically, it's a single crochet and a double crochet in one stitch and then skip the next stitch. And this just creates a really nice, ever so slightly scalloped edge, which doesn't really translate as well in this one as scallop, but it just gives a really nice finished clean edge here, and it will also hide any sins pretty darn well. So we're getting close to the point here, which of course I've put my stitch marker in. So because I've made fewer rows here, I've got already to the stitch before the stitch marker. So for the point, I'm going to work a single crochet and a double crochet in the stitch before the stitch marker, the stitch with the stitch marker, and the stitch after. And that will give us enough stitches here at the point so that we get a nice curve around and it doesn't pull in or pucker at all. So in the one before the stitch marker, we work our single crochet and double crochet. So just like before, we're just not skipping one in the middle. We're going to do it in 3 stitches in a row. And at this point, you could move the stitch marker up if you wanted to, but you don't really need to. We're pretty well done with it. So there's our single crochet and our double crochet. Go to the next one, single crochet and double crochet. Okay, and you can see that just gets us around the corner really nicely. And then you can go right on back to skip a stitch, single crochet and double crochet in the next. And for this border round 2, it's actually more of a row because we're going to stop when you get to the other corner, the other shoulder corner. we're not going to work across the top for this row, unless you really want to. Make it your own. If you want to add another row across the top, you certainly can do so. So we are getting darn close here to our final corner here, which would be the one at the shoulder. Oops, forgot that's a double. It's supposed to be a single crochet first. There we are, and a double. And there we are. At this point, I would break off and have a finished shawl. And in the original, I also added tassels. If you want to, you can certainly do that. They're very optional. I like to add one at the point and one on each shoulder corner, if you will. But that is the basics of the Big Sky Shawl. I hope you've enjoyed this pattern. If you have, please do give it a like and be sure to subscribe to our channel. And thank you so much for watching.